Morning everyone. So today I'm going to give you probably quite a high level overview of some challenges between research and practice and how potentially we can overcome them. Because I've done this a few times, I've kind of tried to change it a little bit, and I'm going to give you experiences of my kind of interactions with Venus and Mars in terms of research and practice, and also share with you some things that I think would help us all on our next mission to kind of make our lives easier. My hope is genuinely that everything I say people think is obvious and know, because then it means actually we don't have any challenges in research and practice. But I imagine that there will be things that I do say that are obvious and you kind of roll your eyes at, and other bits that you think that would be quite helpful. So in terms of my space mission, over the last however many years, so I'm really fortunate at the moment that I have a number of roles. So as a researcher in a university, I also then work within an England performance unit for the RFL as a research lead there, and then for some professional clubs. So I almost look at it as research, practice and policy. And probably as you guys have, I've met lots of different aliens and people speaking different languages talking about the same thing, and actually you kind of leave things like, it's not surprising that things aren't as easy as they should be when people aren't actually talking about things in the same way. So that's the kind of context I'll come through, and the examples I will use will be mainly from rugby. So if you start back as far as you can, for me research and practice should be the same thing. The reality is, if sports science as an emerging discipline, it's a discipline whereby we're producing something that should help an end user. There is a genuine end user, whether that's health, whether that's performance, whether that's within specific disciplines. And practice should want to use research because everyone in practice is paid to get better and to improve what they're currently working in. So from the basic thing, they should in theory work, and they should work really well together. But where the challenges come for me is that when you kind of start moving up a level and people start getting older for the story, and for the research and practice, that you kind of see that people then kind of emerge into different interests, and practitioners become very playful, sample, don't really stick at anything for that long, get bored of things really quickly, where researchers kind of tend to get involved in something, stick with it, and actually go with it for a long time to understand the depth. And you almost kind of get this disconnect when you're looking at kind of depth and breadth, when you're then trying to join the dots on applying the research to the real world, whether that is policy or practice. And then as you kind of get older and older, the researcher then becomes more obsessive with things, that wants to stick with things, want to find things. And if this is a relationship, which I'll do it as a counselling session, and the practice person just can't make their mind up. They keep changing their mind. You go to them with something, I don't know whether everyone experiences this, they ask you a question, you disappear for 3 weeks, you spent a lot of time on it, you come back and they've changed your mind. And you're like, well, I can't just do things overnight. So we need to then come up with a way of actually kind of building this relationship between research and practice, which in the reality is you have people that are now, as they progress, probably doing very different things. And unfortunately, I think at times the relationship breaks down. And you can probably classify how and why the relationship breakdowns based on one of the persons in the relationship being overly complicated and one being overly needy. And I think for me this is where almost the challenge in the language and how we use and how we apply research and how we ask about research kind of comes in. So for the idea of this, I'm going to take these couple to a counselling session. I'm going to talk you through what they found out from the counsellor. When you generally tend to look at research and you look at the disconnects and the challenges and where the problems start, they always start at this for me. They always start between good, cheap and fast. And if you think about research and practice from both perspectives, so you're talking about, yeah, except there's people in the middle that do both, but I'm using this as the extreme decision maker signing the checks off. That we almost kind of, we go through this kind of, we want to do the best research we can from a scientific point of view, which means that it's expensive and probably slow. People in practice don't have time. They also don't have money. So to pay for what we need. So actually you kind of come with this and it's like, well, okay, if he's good, cheap and fast, which two do you want? And then you get to the point of, well, I'll just carry on doing what I was doing anyway because I don't want any of those two. And I would put it down to probably the two things in which we can get better at and we can use better and talk better about is good and cheap. And I don't think that there's a lack of funding available in professional sport for research. I genuinely mean that. I think there's a lack of value for what research offers to professional sport. And I think that if we start to almost, when I say sell, that sounds like you're trying to give somebody something that they don't want. But if we start to then sell research better, I think the value will increase. I think the opportunities for funding to do the good quality, fast research that genuinely have impact will then actually work. And I think that's really important for me around the cost and value. And the reason why I believe this so much is that I did my PhD in fluid balance and sodium homeostasis. And it was expensive research. And I found out that rugby players should drink when they're thirsty. But I knew why they drink when they're thirsty. And genuinely, if I went to the club and said, can I have 50p to do this research, they'd have been like, no, I'd rather waste that on a coffee. But actually, that research was probably more scientifically robust than me going to them and saying, do you want me to quantify the match demands and the recovery profiles of all your players? Yeah. But actually, from an academic perspective, that probably gets published in a lower impact journal than the other one did. And that's, to me, around where you start getting disagreements between what good is, who's classifying good, who's judging good, and then the cost and the value. So we'll start to look at how we can change some of these, address some of these things. So this is a research kind of flow that we've presented to actually help the research and the practitioners probably just understand the high level a little bit more. And we developed this after we'd done a lot of applied research, because what we generally found was whenever you present anything back to people in academia, they always ask you something on your area in more detail. Agree? They go, that's right. Whenever you do anything to practitioners, they ask you something that's completely irrelevant. I remember I went to Cape Town to present some work on the physical qualities of rugby league players, and all the question was on psychology. I'm like, I don't know, but actually they were so interested in the breadth that we were so driven by the depth it didn't make sense. So we came up with this, and it was a way of actually everyone understanding what the rules of engagement are. So the 8 traditional steps for us were create a research question, you gain ethics approval, you recruit participants, you collect data, analyse data, you write the paper, you submit for publication, you create knowledge, academic job done. And then for us, it was almost important to try and integrate that into policy and practice. Because when you work in sport, and for those people that do actually engage with sport, and you realise that the contextual and the probably the business-informed decisions that people make, actually it means that research can't always fit. You know, something as simple as in rugby union, they don't sign players professionally until 18. In rugby league, they sign them at 16. Well, the reality is, you go and have a look at an under 16 or under 17 rugby union players training programme, and you'd cringe. But no one has ownership of them. They're doing the best they can, but it's a late specialisation sport. So actually, that research doesn't necessarily fit perfectly with that environment just because of the rules of the sport. So that was a reason why we believe that's important. And for me, there was 4 steps that were fundamental to get right in this process for people in research and practice to get along. The first one was creating the research question. I don't think there's a lack of good research out there. I think there's potentially a lack of relevant research questions out there in the literature. And we go back to who should be involved in designing the research question. If you take step 9 out of that and you think about the traditional flow and you think about an undergraduate or a master's student, they get their research questions from the literature. So actually, you're almost building on foundations that potentially may not be relevant anymore. From an applied perspective, I'm not talking about a theoretical kind of mechanism perspective. I'm talking about an application. So can we create better research questions by engaging practitioners and researchers in that decision? And go back to one thing is just ask yourselves at the end of it, will the answers be useful or interesting? And actually, my PhD was really interesting. People go, oh, that's really interesting that rugby players drink when they're thirsty. But it's not useful because they just did what they did anyway. And then the next thing is that we get criticised a lot as scientists is not using elite cohorts. Well, that study doesn't make sense because you've done it university students. But if we go back to better questions, and the people who are the gatekeepers of those athletes want to know the answers to those questions, in theory that means we get better access to better participants, which therefore then means that we can do research which people want to use and want to then share, want to then apply in the practice. And the other thing is that we've then got to make sure we agree our feedback mechanism, the time of it, and also how we do it, because a mean and standard deviation means very little to somebody who wants individual data. But we, as my background as a physiologist, just love collecting data, and because it doesn't make sense, we just put it as a mean in SDs and we understand it. But actually at that point there, you kind of lose probably what the richness of the data is. And also the time of that, agreeing a timeline of when we do that. Simply, you could agree whether the research can be used this season or next season. And actually, everyone's expectations are then met. And then, like I said, in terms of the next one is let's try and integrate into practice. Not be afraid if it doesn't work and it doesn't apply. That's fine, because we've still learned something from it. But actually, if it does apply, let's use that into the next research question. But actually, you've got to, so that was from a perspective of we've got to make sure that the researcher is doing what the practitioner wants, what the coach wants. But actually, there's something around innovation, because actually, I find a lot in some roles that we don't know what we want. We know what we don't want, and when people offer a study, we go, nah, but we don't actually know what we do want, which probably means researchers are needy as well. So we've got to think about how we can innovate and how we can do things differently. So the phrase I always kind of consider is if Henry Ford have asked people what they wanted, they'd have said faster horses. So I think that actually the innovation becomes from doing things further away and doing things differently. So the reason I use this slide was I read Martin Brichette's editorial around sports science being up in space, and I think he's got some really, really valuable points. And it's around the challenge of applying what we do know from the science into the field. But I believe that actually, and there's a lot of people I would send to space, but there's that actually at times that we can send things off into space and see whether they come back better, and they're the slow research questions that people didn't necessarily ask. These are just a couple of bits, and they're, you know, looking at the game demands of under-16s players versus rugby league players, we compared international club players using the rolling peak demands. And actually we found that the under-16 players have the same peak running demands as NRL senior players. So actually we don't know what to do, but we definitely know that we shouldn't be using peak running demands during a game as a talent ID thing, because there's no way that those kids can go and play NRL. But that data suggests that they're technically ready. And then this is some of Tom Sawchuk's work where we looked at everyone's collecting daily well-being, perceived recovery scale a lot, and actually we collected a year's worth of data, so a slow research question, applied some mixed models to it, and looked actually how not only training load but sleep influenced our recovery scales. So given these are youth athletes that do more than just train, that actually we found for the top one that training load, high and low training load influenced our daily well-being but not our perceived recovery scale, where sleep was a bigger influence of our daily well-being more than training load. So actually if an athlete comes in and you modify something based on something you're assessing but you're assuming that it's to do with training load, we might as well just taken the PlayStation off them, because the reason were they were just sleeping less. And again, another example is there's some great work at the moment on nutrition demands coming out of Liverpool John Moores from Graham Close and James Morton's group. And we were interested in the energetic demands of rugby, because if you look on a piece of paper what rugby players do in training, they do 1 or 2 weight sessions a week. They probably do two 30 to 60 minute field sessions per week, and they play a game. Well, actually, that's not that much in terms of what they, in theory, for the energy costs that they need. So what we did with this study was we did a randomised control, matched everything except one of the groups, on one of the weeks, they did 20 collisions, just tackled each other 20 times. And that 15-20-minute contact training session increased energy costs by 500 calories across that week. So actually, it wasn't the training load that they were doing that was causing energetic demands. It was the recovery cost from collisions. So a great weight loss strategy, just punch yourself in the arm and get some muscle damage. So, but that's again, like nobody asked us to do that, and that was a slow study, it was an expensive study, we had to send things back to the lab, nobody benefited from the game. But in terms of what we understood from the knowledge, it really did help. So going back to kind of this research and practice sliding continuum, you've probably got the challenge with research is that, especially in my field, we like to measure things and actually we can't explain things sometimes, you know, especially in sports performance, team sport performance. It's really hard to explain the reasons somebody does or doesn't win. But actually in practice, especially when you work in organisations where people come through the more traditional retired player route, that actually it's an organisation full of anecdotes and experience. And that's not saying that that's a bad thing, because actually they offer some really good critiques to our obvious data. But actually, that's the challenge that we've got, is in research, we need to realise that we can't measure everything, and in practice, that you need data to start supporting some of the assumptions that you may or may not have. And then here's the biggest challenge that makes no sense when you look at it in terms of the counselling session, okay? Research wants to help practice, but it publishes all its love letters in a place that nobody can read apart from researchers. So you kind of look at it that way, and again, you kind of go back to it's really difficult to bridge this gap when actually the traditional means of academic publication don't support that. And I'm going to challenge another thing as well, that what academic publications are based on, and I get it, is originality and novelty. We want to do something that's original and novel to progress science. I don't know whether anyone's ever tried to do anything really obvious, but that makes it really difficult. And by obvious, I mean, go back and compare, understand the match demands from something that we should fundamentally understand, from different sports, from different levels, from different sexes. Good luck, because everyone's been original and novel and done it different. So actually, you kind of, when you challenge something like, when you ask an obvious question from a policy or practice point of view, that actually the way that we do things in science, to progress science, which is really good, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't be innovative and push the boundaries that way, but it almost makes it really difficult to then apply that, because you can't then do that. And I think one of the things that does concern me is, and I'm not about doing research just to repeat the same thing in a different cohort, but I think everyone would accept that there's a complete lack of sports science literature on female athletes out there. But if you can't repeat the methods that we've done, how are female athletes going to catch up? Like, and actually, we could all in this room have a career out of just repeating sports science work in female cohorts to actually understand female athletes better and female physiology better. But I think that's where we've got to, for me, from a research point of view, maybe challenge the system. And practice just needs to stop moving the target. Because again, in terms of the turnover of people in practitioner roles, policymaker roles, that when we do research, we try and do what you ask, but they don't know what they ask and they keep changing it. So these are the kind of, the things that we try and overcome. I try and make things simple for me in terms of how I look at things and how you judge things. And I think one simple way is looking at efficacy studies and effectiveness studies and using the model that they use in sports medicine and applying that to now like sports science. I think there's loads of efficacy studies in terms of really well-controlled lab-based studies that we know how to make athletes better and how to make athletes recover more or to adapt, etc. But the effectiveness is when you then apply it to the real world and looking at why it does or doesn't work in practice. So, you know, from a public health point of view, you know that if you bring overweight individuals into a lab and do a certain number of HIIT sessions, they'll be in an energy deficit and lose weight. But if you ask everyone to go and do those HIIT sessions, they don't do it. And I think that for sports science, we spend a lot of our time in the efficacy, because that's what then develops the high quality mechanistic studies, which are good, but actually I'd like to see some more effectiveness studies. And I suppose simply, again, in terms of, I try and use non-academic language when communicating this back, it's around which of the studies are going to generate our knowledge and which are going to apply our knowledge. And actually, I don't know whether people disagree, but I would say that the literature is in such a great place now. You could spend the next 50 years just applying what we know in sport and still make sport better, in addition to doing research as well. So actually understanding the challenges of actually applying the knowledge, as opposed to creating more knowledge, but I think actually the obvious thing to do those concurrently. This is a great way for me in terms of, again, just kind of reflecting on how I've dealt with research and how I've sold research. So the Dunning-Kruger in terms of our relationship between competence and confidence. So when we have low competence in something, we have high confidence, and then as our competence improves, our confidence changes. So I don't know about you, but whenever I do any research, because no coach ever listens to me, whenever I find anything, I bang on their door really loud and show them it and sell them it. And that's the point usually where you have kind of lowish competence but high confidence, because you found something new that you want them to use, you want them to better their practice. And then generally what happens then is we do more work and realise what it doesn't do, and kind of sit in this low confidence phase and kind of as our competence is improving. But I think for me that the next challenge is around should we as sports scientists spend all our time critiquing work and showing things that don't work, or trying to then progress things and actually improve our knowledge? And I think, and the reason I have to use that, the acute chronic, I think it was implemented really well. Actually, people started to do training load reasonably well, and then now no one trusts it because of the mathematical coupling, which is a valid point. The fact that actually it's not predictive, the false positives, which are all valid points. But if we keep doing that, it's not surprising no one in sport believes us anymore every time we tell them something new. Because then in 2 years later we go, oh, you know that thing that we got you to do? No, don't do it anymore. So I think that's a challenge in terms of how much we do sell things and how much we then try and work to then make things better. And then around our language, so you know, we find something new, we use the literature language, or I do, and actually then I realise that the coaches have been saying that to me in a different way for years and years and years. So again, this goes back to kind of how hard we do push things that we find. And then, you know, if you use a car analogy, this is stolen from Evan van Hagen from a sports medicine analogy, in terms of the car being our knowledge, and we know more about sports science, so our car has got better, our knowledge has got better. But actually then the road in which we're driving it on may not be appropriate for where our knowledge is at. And this goes back to what I was talking about, knowledge application versus knowledge generation. That generating more and more knowledge and then getting more and more frustrated that nobody uses it because nobody can access it, because nobody reads it, and actually people's challenges are that the coach doesn't listen to them or talk to them, or the coach has something in the contract that if they lose 5 games they get sacked. So it's not surprising they don't look for long-term kind of sports science, evidence-based strategies. Makes sense? So I'm going to just talk quickly about some GPS, and I think the GPS for me it's similar to acute chronic. It's a fantastic innovation in technology to actually allow sports scientists to start doing things better in practice. But I do think we need to be careful. And the first one is that obviously the way that the GPS simply works is obviously we get an instantaneous velocity over time, and we can average that to get total distance because it makes sense. It doesn't make sense when you think about averaging things and everything above the line and below the line are technically you're considering the same importance. So actually we need to start now to looking at how we value important information, not just think it's important because we're collecting it. So Dan Weaving done some cool work on this, and it's around, we collect all this information, but what does it actually mean, and which part of that information is actually telling us something unique, or are the data just telling us the same story? So Dan ran a principal component on a within participant data from a year's worth of rugby union work, and we found that session RPE, play load, and total distance all clustered. They all told us exactly the same things for players, which makes sense when you think about how they're calculated, because session RPE is rating of perceived exertion times duration. Play load is accumulated accelerometer over time. And total distance is average velocity times by time. So actually, given that time is such a heavy factor in all those, it's not surprising that they all tell us the same thing. And then for us, in this data, high-speed distance told us something completely different. So actually there we now end up with two different, we can now use just two measures which tell us something completely unique. High speed distance, and then we would go with total distance and session RPE, and we'd go with session RPE because we can also then use it in like gym and combat and wrestling type training as well. And the simplicity of all this as well is that actually a lot of the objective things we do correlate really well with our subjective measures. So our measures of fatigue and recovery, rate and perceived exertion, like I showed you there. So actually this goes back to our application that we can also do some very simple things done well. There's a difference between simple and wrong. Collecting an RPE on a non-validated scale isn't simple, it's wrong. But actually collecting RPE in a really robust way is actually really simple and really useful. And then unfortunately for us potentially is the reality is that we don't prescribe the training coaches do. And actually this study was done in some youth sport athletes, and it showed that when coaches planned easy, moderate or hard sessions, on easy sessions the athletes upregulated, and on hard sessions the athletes downregulated, so actually all sessions end up pretty much the same. So we can understand around periodization why we should do things, but it's around why would it work. And actually this was, I was up there just having a look on Twitter before, and actually there's a paper just accepted in Science and Medicine and Football on formative coach feedback actually improves this, which is great because actually now we're actually starting to make the road better. So if we go back to our counselling session around one person in the relationship being pretty complicated and one person being pretty needy, I think that the solution for me is just keeping it simple. I genuinely believe that actually that if we keep research simple from a start point, that we get better policy and practice engagement. And actually keeping things simple means things become quicker. And actually then people start to buy into the research process as opposed to the research outcomes. The research findings become more useful, and that leads to then the co-constructed questions which then go through that cycle and actually produce some really high quality, impactful research. And the other thing is around just talking more. And I've heard it a lot, and I'm guilty of it with some things around you kind of start with best intentions, then you get busy, and then you kind of don't catch up with someone as much. But actually for someone in a research or policy environment, they don't want hour-long presentations, they want 5-minute coffees or kind of catch-ups to keep, it's almost like nudge behaviour, to keep up to date, because when you disappear, collect something, come back, analyse it, present it back as a bar graph, it's really hard to actually understand what's gone on in there and where we're actually pulling the information from. And the reason why I'm really optimistic, and I think that hopefully a lot of that was useful and interesting, but hopefully some of it obvious as well, is that there's more and more of these applied PhDs going on. So actually, if you think about what, and I'm not saying it's bad now, the academic field will look like in 20 years' time, there's going to be more people that have an appreciation of both sides. And actually, if you think about then what practice is going to look like, there's more and more people doing applied PhDs, therefore there's going to be more people going into applied jobs with research experience. So actually, we're going to then get people who are speaking the same language, still wanting different things because their jobs are different, but actually that, I think, creates a better approach to not only improve our knowledge and our understanding, but also the application of our knowledge and understanding to make sport better. The end. Thank you.